In my most recent video, I made my own coach lighting for a Lima Mark II, using pickup springs on the axles of my wheels to take power from the track. But why an old Lima, when a newer Hornby or Bachmann coach would arguably benefit more? The simple answer is the wheels. On the Lima, the axle and one of the wheels are physically attached, the other insulated by a plastic bush, perfect for the springs. My Hornby has bushes on both wheels, so the axle is fully insulated from the track. No good for our pickup springs. Even if we wanted to, we can't just switch them out for the Lima ones, as they don't fit either the Hornby or the Bachmann, my collet having the same fully isolated wheels. But that's what we're here to fix, making our axles live, so we can get lighting into all of our coaches, especially the ones that deserve it most. So let's get to work by removing the wheels, flexing the sides of the bogie frames and unclipping the ends of the axles, just like we did with the Lima. The Hornby is slightly stiffer, but the wheels still come out easily. My Bachmann is a bit more stubborn, the sides of the bogie on the collet being quite a bit thicker, and even though I managed to release one end with the thumbnail, I needed to lever out the other with the assistance of a small screwdriver, taking care not to damage the frame. Out of our bogies we can get a better look at the wheels, and clearly see the plastic bushes that insulate one from the other, both on the Bachmann and the Hornby, which even though they're quite different sizes, I'm going to be modifying to get that axle live in the same way as each other. But before that, let's look at an off-the-shelf solution, live axle wheel sets from Peter's Spares, which just like our Limas, have one wheel directly attached to the axle, the other insulated by a plastic bush. I believe they were originally used to power table lamps on Hornby Pullman cars, but are now manufactured specially for Peter's Spares. All part numbers and supplier details in the description. Close up, we can clearly see the different wheel attachments, plastic bush on one side, solid on the other, just like the Lima ones, although considerably more refined. The only real issue is that at 14.1mm they're quite large, too big for a lot of coaches. I actually measured them to be slightly larger than that, but even so, very close to the size of my Bachmann wheels, so in that case, a suitable replacement. And without further ado, let's get on with fitting the springs, starting by removing the insulated wheel. On my rather more crude Lima ones, I just did this with some long-nose pliers, but for my new, less basic ones, I've got a marginally more sophisticated approach. This is to loosely grip the axle in our long-nose pliers and slide it along to the plastic bush, which is considerably smaller than the Lima one. Then, with the pointy end of the axle on a spare piece of plywood, tap the end of the pliers with a small hammer, keeping our wheel parallel to the surface, so we've got even downward pressure. The plywood not only protects the tip, it stops it all skidding about, and even though the axle sinks in a bit, our wheel is soon to the end, where it can be pulled off by hand, ready for the pickup springs. These are made by DCC Concepts, and with 48 in a packet, that'll do us nicely for a good number of coaches. Essentially a coil of fine wire, designed to fit the wheel sets of whichever gauge we're using. They simply slip over the axle, where with a minimum of friction, they pick up the current from one of our tracks, the other insulated by a plastic bushed wheel, and it's that we'll push on now. It goes on relatively easily, while still being tight enough to stay in place. But working out exactly where that should be is greatly helped by one of these, a back-to-back gauge, in my case also from DCC Concepts. This is essentially a brass cylinder, the width of the ideal distance between the insides of our wheels, although in our case the insides of the rims of the wheels, so the gauge needs to be positioned slightly further out, otherwise we'll get the wrong distance and the gauge will get trapped inside the rims. This makes using it slightly trickier than usual, but even so, it doesn't take long to get our distances right, although it's good to check both sides. And when we're happy, we can fit our now conductive wheel set into the bogie, where even though they're not Bachmann wheels, they fit nicely. Now for this video, I'm not going to go into the rest of the lighting, as that's pretty comprehensively covered in the previous one. Obviously, our bogie moulding is quite different, and specific components will have to go elsewhere, but the essentials are the same, certainly in terms of the pickups. Now we come to the real DIY bit. Even if the ones I got had been the right size for my Hornby Mark I, at £6 a coach they're quite expensive. So rather than replacing what are after all perfectly good wheels, I'm going to adapt them to get that axle live, at a tiny fraction of that price. And this starts by removing one of the wheels, in the same way as before. Pliers loosely holding the axle, a few gentle taps of my little hammer, drifting off the wheel, along with the plastic bush, which easily presses out, pushing it in through the outside of the wheel and pulling on the flange on the inside, leaving a nice hole. What we're going to do next is effectively make a conductive bush, and for that I've got some brass tube, with the same outside diameter as the hole in the wheel, which for the Hornby and the Bachmann is 3mm, and either by luck or coincidence of design has a 2mm hole down the middle, perfect for our axle. Before cutting to length, I just want to file down the edges. This will make it considerably easier to fit, allowing us to line up the end before hammering home. And it's obviously much easier to do this when we've got the whole length of the tube to hold onto. When that's done, it's into the vise, leaving about 1 centimetre sticking out the end, where we can make our cut using a razor saw. The brass is really quite soft, so this isn't difficult. We're looking for a length around about 5 or 6mm, the thickness of our wheel plus a bit. This will help keep everything straight on the axle. We're bound to have a little bit of burr on the cut end, so it's back in the vise with our newly cut bit to file that down. Now to get our conductive bush into the wheel. We want most of that extra length to be on the inside, so lining up our beveled edge with a hole and keeping our little bit of brass tube as straight as possible. We need to whack it with a hammer and drift it down into the wheel, gently at first to maintain alignment, then rather more vigorously. Flat on the cutting mat, we can get it down to the front face, then held over our open pliers. A few extra taps will get it a little bit further, so our filed bevel sticks out the front a tiny bit. With all that hammering, the fit into the wheel is really very tight, which is what we want, but it's also reduced the diameter of the inner hole, so it no longer slides onto the axle. We do want that fit to be snug, but pushing too hard will just pop out the bush, so I'm just reinstating the correct diameter with a 2mm drill bit. The relative softness of the brass meant everything got a bit squished when we drove it into the wheel, but the good news is that also means it's easy to rectify, the drill really just skimming the inside of the hole. But do go carefully. We want our axle to fit, but not too loose so it wobbles about, throwing our wheel off centre. Now we're back on familiar territory, fitting our pickup spring exactly like before, sliding it over the end of the axle. The only difference is it's the fixed wheel we're doing, and to hold it securely on the axle, I'm going to use some conductive paint, giving it a really good stir first, and applying it to the end of the axle, which I've thoroughly cleaned. Then it's on with our wheel, twisting it about a bit as we push it on, so the paint spreads evenly, completely filling the joint between wheel and axle. When it's dry, that will firmly glue it in place, but until then we've got plenty of time to adjust the position using our back-to-back gauge. We could of course solder the join, but I found the conductive paint was very effective as a glue, and considerably easier. But be patient, as I was told it could take several days to cure properly. And when it has, we can pop the wheels back in the bogie, ready to be wired up for the lighting. As I said before, I'm not going to go through that here, that's in the other video. My Hornby coach has plenty of room underneath, so my Lima method can be followed fairly closely, with only minor adaptation. But if I do get round to doing a specific video, I will of course add a link, and if you want notifications of that or other projects, don't forget to subscribe. Before I finish up, I just want to return to my Bachmann coach. We've seen how we can replace the wheels with the ones from Peter's spares, but we can also adapt the existing ones, using exactly the same method as the Hornby. And as a bit of a recap, I'll very quickly run through the method again, pointing out any slight differences. The bushes are a little bit tighter, making the wheels slightly more difficult to get off, and the axles, instead of being nice and shiny, are coated in black paint. This will of course prevent our pickup springs from conducting properly, so I need to get that off. For this I'm using a chrome polish, just rubbing the axle with a small wad. This is slightly less abrasive than Brasso, as we only want to remove the paint, which soon comes off, leaving a nice shiny axle. The plastic bush is removed in exactly the same way as before, although I did find it a little more stubborn than the Hornby one. And we're on familiar ground, prepping and cutting the brass tube, ready to be inserted into the wheel. At $4.99 for 30 centimetres, that was relatively expensive, but I can get a lot of bushes out of it, and if my maths is right, that should work out at about 50p a coach, a considerable saving on the price of the Peter Spares wheels, and I won't have a load of perfectly good ones going begging. Inserting the bush was a little bit easier than with the Hornby, and it fitted the axle without any further drilling, sliding on nicely, so we can immediately go on to fitting the spring. My conductive paint is also already stirred, so we can dispense that straight from the bottle, applying a good dollop on the end of the axle. Like the tube, this was also relatively expensive, but we only need a tiny amount per wheel, so we'll have enough for a good number of coaches. And with spring and wheel installed, we can check the back-to-back and leave to dry, before installing our wheel sets back in the bogies. Not forgetting to put our newly bushed wheels on opposite sides, so we get pickup from both tracks. And there you have it, a simple and cost-effective solution for getting all of our coaches lighting ready, adding just a little bit of extra work, with the total price per coach still well under £5. I think you'll agree, worth every penny.